Shalom and welcome to Shikul Da'at. I'm Rabbi Josh Rose. What does it mean to be holy? That's the subject of our Torah portion, Kedoshim, a word that means holy. The opening verses of the Parsha indicate that something very important is happening. The Torah gives us a little heads up about this. Here's how the Parsha begins. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Which means Hashem spoke to Moses saying, speak to the whole community of Israel. So that is the heads up. We've heard those words before, kol adat b'nei Yisrael, the whole community of Israel, but in a few different verses in Exodus and once in Leviticus, but never before has Hashem told Moses to address the entire people. So we know that whatever is going to follow is of singular importance. What is it that Moses is supposed to say to all of the people? Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. You shall be holy, because I, Hashem, your God, am holy. Before we dive in, let's just take a moment to think about the context of this command to be holy. Think about what preceded these verses. For the last several Parshiot, God has instructed Moses concerning the priests and their behavior in the holy spaces and the rituals that they are to perform on behalf of the children of Israel. But then in this week's Parsha, we learn that holiness is not limited to priests. This is what Jonathan Sacks has called the democratization of holiness. All of us have a role to play. And holiness is not limited to the area of the tabernacle, but has to be practiced everywhere in ordinary life. So a little aside, this Torah portion is special to me. My father loves this Parsha. His emphasis as a rabbi was and still is on the social and ethical imperatives of the Torah. He sees those as the key to a life of holiness. And indeed, those verses from the Torah are the core section of our Parsha. But one of the challenging things about Kedoshim is the range of mitzvot within it. They seem kind of disconnected. It does indeed include those sections addressing social equity and justice that Dad loves. But just in the first 5 verses, we're told to honor parents, to observe Shabbat, to make certain kinds of animal sacrifices, and to avoid idolatry. We'll return to this issue of the scattered nature of the mitzvot at the end of the podcast, but as a way to try to make sense of it, we're going to dive in to those passages against idolatry. So in the 4th verse, we are told, Al tifnu el ha'elelim ve'elohe masecha ve'lo ta'asu lachem ani Hashem Elokeichem. Do not turn to idols, and molten gods do not make. I, the Lord, am your God. What does it mean exactly to turn to idols? Rashi, bringing the interpretation of the Sifra, explains, do not turn to idols. That means do not worship them. Well, seems straightforward. But in fact, the Gemara, the Talmud, discovers a much deeper insight here. The Talmud teaches, Asur lehistakel ba mishum shene'emar al tifnu el ha'elelim. Mai Talmuda amar Rabbi Chanin al tifanu el mid'atchem. Which means one is prohibited from looking at idols. For it is written, and then the Gemara points to our verse, do not turn to idols. How does this verse prove that you cannot even look at idols? It says, al tifnu el, meaning do not push God from your mind. Rashi interprets the phrase, do not turn to idols, very reasonably as a prohibition against idol worship. But the Talmud is discussing something different. While Rashi focuses on the outward expression of idolatry, the Talmud explores the inner state of idolatry, which is, according to it, when a person is not thinking about God. If you listened to this podcast last week, you might remember that there too we talked about the outer versus the inner dimension of mitzvot. There we explored teshuvah, and here we're discussing idolatry, but that same outer versus inner distinction is at play in these two interpretations of Rashi and of the Talmud. But in any event, to return to our topic, what does the Talmud really mean? Is it even possible to think about God in every moment? Now we'll look at a teaching that tries to explain the state of consciousness itself. It comes from the Degel Machaneh Yehudah, who shares something in the name of his grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, the great 18th century spiritual revolutionary who founded the Jewish way we now call Hasidism. The teaching starts with an exploration of the Talmudic interpretation that I read earlier. So again, the Talmud interpreted the command, do not turn to idols, to mean, do not push God from your mind. The phrase from your mind in Hebrew is mid'atchem, from your da'at. Now, the word da'at can mean mind, knowledge, or awareness, among several other things. So keep that in your da'at as we read the Degel Machaneh Yehudah. He says, this has to be understood in light of what my honored grandfather of blessed memory said about the verse, do not turn to idols. And again, that's the verse from our Torah portion. He goes on, he taught that immediately when one turns from cleaving her thoughts to the Holy One, she serves other gods. That is, she is considered an idolater. I will explain this according to my understanding. One who serves Hashem in all of her ways fulfills the verse in Deuteronomy which says, in all your ways know God. This means that one should do everything with da'at, like eating, drinking, sleeping, and engaging with others to bring people close to God, or in order to turn them away from sadness, or help them in their business to sustain them so that they will not have to hold back in their service to God. If one does this with da'at, then everything is done as divine service. Even those things thought of as ordinary will be done with purity and holiness. See how he builds on the Talmudic idea that we are to always think about God? He says that it means that we should strive for a constant state of awareness of God in all things and in all of our actions. This may sound familiar. When he says, do everything with da'at, like eating, drinking, sleeping, and engaging with others, the 21st century reader might think, oh, that's mindfulness. And that word, mindfulness, is everywhere in our culture. A couple of years ago, a major magazine declared the year of mindfulness. But it seems that that year is still unfolding. Articles in the New York Times describe mindfulness as a method for alleviating our anxiety, for getting better grades, for being a better athlete. You see it everywhere. Newspapers, articles, blog posts, news programs. The language gets thrown into religious discussions as well, and you may have in fact heard me use it. But mindfulness, as we talk about it today, seems to mean something different than da'at, and the distinction is important for us to understand the core idea in our Parshat and in Jewish life. So let's think about it. Psychology today defines mindfulness as, quote, living in the moment and awakening to our current experience rather than dwelling on the past or anticipating the future. Now, I'm all for this, and it can indeed be healing and calming to practice mindfulness in our frantic lives. But mindfulness, I believe, has a kind of neutrality. It's parv in a way that da'at is not. That's precisely why it is used for so many divergent ends. Professional athletes use it to improve performance, students use it to improve their grades, therapists use it for struggling clients. But da'at is something different. There's actually a story about the Baal Shem Tov which illustrates the point. In it, the Baal Shem Tov tells one of his Hasidim that he wants to get kosher wine. The man goes and scrupulously cultivates grapes, and cultivating them just so, watches over every single aspect of the process, absolutely focused on making sure that he fulfills this mitzvah assigned to him by his Rebbe. This goes on for months, I suppose, as he watches over the crop and the crushing of the grapes and eventually the bottling, making sure the bottles are appropriate and kosher and in good condition, and then the transportation of the wine in a cart. Each step he is singularly focused on the safe transportation of the wine. He has not taken his mind off of any aspect of the production from beginning to end since the moment that his spiritual master instructed him. In the end, it turns out that the wine is spoiled and the man is devastated and seeking to understand how this could have happened. And the Baal Shem Tov tells him that he failed because he did not plead with God to help him. So what I take from this somewhat sad story is that da'at is not simply a very deep observational awareness and great care. It's an engaged spiritual consciousness that sees the divine breath animating all things in every moment. It involves a kind of living relationship between a person and the God-created world all around, one which begins with distinction and difference and ends with unification, or cleaving, in the words of the Degel Machaneh Yehudah. And this is important because that awareness of the relationship between creator and created leads to a certain way of living, a way toward the desire to create unity and oneness through our thoughts and actions. And that is, in the language of our tradition, the desire to fulfill God's will, or to put it in Kabbalistic language, to unify God and God's name. Mindfulness is a tool. Da'at is a relationship of love and responsibility. If you think back to the examples that the Degel Machaneh Yehudah gave of da'at in action, he mentioned things like eating and drinking, but then he talked about reaching out to help other people who are maybe having a difficult time financially or emotionally or spiritually, and trying to make a difference in their lives. Da'at implies responsibility, and not simply the engagement of the individual to the objects or purposes in his life or her life. And that, in turn, is how we might make sense of the seemingly disparate and disconnected mitzvot throughout our Parshat. Kedoshim starts with the broadest of commands, be holy. And then we wondered why the mitzvot that follow don't seem to form a cohesive whole. But if we understand the command, do not turn to idols, as imploring us to cultivate da'at, then the mitzvah itself shows us that any act done with da'at leads ultimately to the Holy One. And all mitzvot and all people and all actions and all thoughts are wrapped together in the unity created by da'at. Have a good Shabbos, and thank you so much for listening.